the moment the lead auditor read my name aloud. In that boardroom, my father-in-law's water glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the mahogany table. My mother-in-law grabbed the edge of her chair. My husband's older brother, the one who'd spent 3 years calling me that girl from nowhere Lionel brought home, went the color of old milk, and Lionel, my husband, the man who had quietly believed in me every single day, while his family picked me apart at every holiday dinner. He was sitting right next to his father, and I watched him exhale, slow and steady, like he'd been holding that breath for 3 years too. I had waited a long time for that morning. Let me tell you how we got there. 4 years ago, I was 27 years old and working as a staff accountant at a mid-size firm in Cincinnati. Not a partner, not a senior associate, staff. The kind of person who gets CC'd on emails rather than addressed directly. I wore sensible flats and ate lunch at my desk, and caught the 7:14 bus home most nights, because Lionel and I were saving up for a down payment on a house in Oakley, and 2 car payments at once wasn't something we were ready for. I was proud of that. I didn't think it required an apology. Lionel's family thought otherwise. His father, I'll call him what everyone called him, because no one in that family used first names when a title would do, was a man named Harlan Beckett. Commercial real estate developer, 3rd-generation Cincinnati money, the kind of man whose portrait hung in the lobby of 2 different buildings he owned downtown. He had the handshake of someone who learned it from a book, and the laugh of someone who knew it worked on most people. Harlan Beckett had opinions about everything, and the thing he had the firmest opinions about was what kind of woman his son should have married. The first time I met the family was at their 4th of July party at their house in Indian Hill. 6 acres, pool, a caterer who did the event every year and knew everyone's drink orders by heart. I showed up in a sundress I'd bought at Target the week before, because I didn't own anything nicer that was also appropriate for 90-degree weather. And Harlan's wife, Marguerite, always Marguerite, never Maggie, looked me over once in that specific way that somehow manages to communicate an entire paragraph without a single word. I got placed next to Harlan's sister at dinner. She asked where I'd gone to school. I told her the University of Cincinnati. She nodded and changed the subject. Lionel's brother, the older one, Ashton, asked what I did. I explained my job. He said, "Oh, so like bookkeeping?" I said it was more analytical than that, but I let it go. Lionel's hand found mine under the table and squeezed twice, our private signal for "I see it and I'm sorry." I drove home that night and didn't say much. Lionel knew me well enough not to push. But somewhere around exit 12, he said, "They'll come around." And I said, "I'm not waiting for them to come around, I'm fine." And I mostly meant it. The thing about the Beckett family, the thing I couldn't have known sitting at that dinner table, was that their wealth was constructed on a foundation that was beginning, very slowly, to crack. Harlan ran Beckett Capital Group, which managed a portfolio of commercial properties across southwestern Ohio and northern Kentucky. Shopping centers, mixed-use developments, a few office parks, all legitimate on the surface. All reviewed annually by an independent auditor. What I didn't know, what almost no one outside a very small circle knew, was that Harlan had spent approximately 8 years inflating the valuations on a subset of those properties, before using them as collateral for loans that should never have been approved. He had 2 compliant appraisers, a loan officer at a regional bank who had a gambling problem and a quiet understanding with Harlan, and a CFO who knew enough to look the other way and had been compensated accordingly. I didn't find this out at a dinner party. I found it because of a conversation I had at work that had nothing to do with the Becketts. 14 months after that 4th of July, a colleague of mine, a senior associate named Petra, pulled me aside after a team meeting and said she was worried about something she'd seen in a portfolio we weren't even assigned to. She'd been asked to cross-check some numbers for a partner, and something in a set of appraisal documents hadn't added up. The property values didn't match the comparable sales data she'd pulled. The discrepancy was significant. 40–50% in some cases. She was nervous about bringing it forward. I told her I'd look at it with her. 2 things happened in the next week. First, I recognized one of the property addresses. A mixed-use complex in Covington, Kentucky. I'd been to an event there the previous spring with Lionel's family. I remembered Harlan saying something at dinner about it afterward. Something about the renovation costs, the square footage, the tenants he'd lined up. I hadn't paid close attention because real estate wasn't my specialty, and I hadn't liked the way Ashton had talked over me to ask a follow-up question. The second thing was that I did pay attention this time. And the more I looked at the documents Petra had flagged, the less anything made sense. I want to be honest about what I did next and why. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't go to a supervisor. I went home, sat at our kitchen table after Lionel had gone to bed, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Because this wasn't a random company I'd stumbled across. This was my husband's father. This was the family that hosted Christmas dinner and complained about my side dishes and had never once asked me a question about my work that wasn't a polite dismissal disguised as curiosity. If I was right about what I was looking at, the fallout wasn't going to land somewhere abstract. It was going to land on Lionel. I thought about what it would mean to walk away. To tell Petra she must have made an error and close the folder, and go back to my desk and eat lunch and catch the 7:14 home. To never say a word. I couldn't do it. Not because I was brave. I'm still not sure I'm brave. But I had spent years looking at for a living, and numbers don't lie the way people do, and what I was looking at was a lie. A large, methodical, years-long lie that was hurting people I had never met. I called the SEC's whistleblower tip line the following morning from a parking garage, 3 blocks from my office. What happened after that moved slowly at first and then very fast. An investigator named Donovan, who sounded approximately 12 years old on the phone but turned out to be one of the sharpest people I've ever dealt with, called me back within 48 hours. We met at a coffee shop in Blue. He had a yellow legal pad and a to-go cup he never touched. I talked for 2 hours. He asked questions that told me he already knew more than I did. Over the following months, I became what they called a cooperating source. I wasn't an investigator. I wasn't an agent. I was a staff accountant who understood enough about real estate valuation methodology to help them understand what they were looking at, and who had enough peripheral access to the Beckett family to occasionally provide context that the investigator couldn't get documents alone. I kept going to Lionel's family dinners. I kept accepting Marguerite's backhanded compliments about my cooking and Ashton's cheerful condescension about my job. I kept being the wife they were still not entirely sure Lionel should have chosen. During that time, Harlan offered me a job twice, both times framed as generosity. The first time was at a Thanksgiving dinner where Marguerite had seated me at the far end of the table, and Ashton had announced his promotion at the firm he'd just joined. And Harlan, in front of everyone, looked down at me and said, "You know, we could always use a good numbers person. Nothing glamorous, but better than where you are." I smiled. I said I'd think about it. I excused myself to help clear the dessert plates and typed a 3-line message to Donovan on the encrypted app I'd installed on a phone I kept in my gym bag. The second time was more direct. Harlan pulled me aside at a birthday party for Ashton and said he'd been serious and that the offer had an expiration date. I thanked him. I did not take the job. He looked at me a little longer than usual when I declined, not with suspicion exactly, more like he was adjusting something in his mental accounting. I was aware, driving home that night, that I needed to be careful. There's something I haven't said yet, and I'm saying it now because it matters. Lionel didn't know any of this. For almost 2 years, my husband did not know that I was cooperating with a federal investigation into his father's company. That was the part I lay awake over, not the risk to my career, not the logistical difficulty of keeping a secret at scale. Lionel. How I was going to tell him. Whether I was going to tell him before it became unavoidable. Whether he would understand. Donovan told me early on that it was my choice, that there was no obligation to disclose to family members, but that I should be aware of the emotional cost of long-term concealment. He said this in the tone of someone who had watched people try to manage it and knew what it tended to do. I thanked him for the honesty. What I hadn't anticipated was Lionel's sister. Her name was Jessa. She was 24, the youngest of the 3 Beckett children, and she had her mother's cheekbones and her father's directness. Except where Harlan used it as a weapon, Jessa mostly used it to cut through nonsense. She was the only one in the family who had ever asked about my actual job, with what seemed like genuine interest. She was also the one who texted me on a random Wednesday afternoon in February, with a message that said, "Can we get lunch? Just us, somewhere you pick." We met at a Thai place in Hyde Park. She was already there when I arrived. She had ordered 2 waters and was turning her straw wrapper into a very small accordion. She said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth." I said, "Okay." She said, "Are you looking into my dad's company?" The restaurant felt very quiet. I looked at her. She looked back with eyes that were neither accusatory nor afraid, just tired and careful, and like she'd been carrying something alone for longer than was reasonable. I said, "What makes you ask that?" She said, "Because I started noticing things about 2 years ago, and I have a folder on my laptop that I took pictures of and then couldn't figure out what to do with." What Jessa showed me over the next 90 minutes rearranged everything. She had been in her father's home office looking for a charger. This is how so many things start, not with intention, but with a wrong turn. And she'd seen a second set of financial summaries open on his secondary monitor. She hadn't understood exactly what she was looking at, but she'd photographed the screen. Then she'd gone back and photographed more, over several months, on the occasions she visited the house. She had property names. She had names of bank contacts. She had the initials of the CFO on documents that had no business existing in a home office. She was 22 when she started. She'd told no one. "There's a guy my friend is about to invest with," she said, "one of my dad's associates. My friend trusts him because of the connection to our family. I can't let her do that without saying something. I just don't know who to say it to." I told her I could help, and I told her what that would mean. That if she gave me what she had, it didn't stay between us. She nodded. She said she'd known for a long time that it couldn't. She looked at me across the table. You know, she said, my dad has never taken you seriously. I always thought that was strange. You're the sharpest person Lionel has ever been with, but my dad kept you at arm's length at every dinner like he was managing something, like you made him nervous in a way he didn't want to look at directly. I didn't say anything to that, but I thought about it for a long time afterward. The investigation moved significantly faster after Jessa's photographs were incorporated into the case file. What Donovan's team put together over the following 14 months was this. Harlan Beckett had been running an appraisal inflation scheme for approximately 9 years. He had used the inflated valuations as collateral for approximately $42 million in improperly secured loans. He'd laundered proceeds through a subsidiary LLC and through a charitable foundation he'd established for youth athletics in Hamilton County. The foundation was real. It had genuinely funded things. That detail made some of what came later more complicated, not less. Marguerite managed the foundation's day-to-day accounts. The investigators established fairly early that she hadn't known what she was signing. Harlan had used her name and her signature on documents she had never been given reason to scrutinize it to scrutinize. This was its own kind of betrayal, separate from everything else's. The part that was hardest for me personally came about 6 months before the final action. Donovan called me on a Thursday evening and asked if I was free to talk. His voice had a quality I'd learned to recognize as him being careful about something. He told me that in reviewing a set of recently subpoenaed fictional records, his team had identified a third-party vendor relationship that warranted a closer look. The vendor was a small residential landscaping company in Anderson Township. It was the business Lionel had inherited from his grandfather on his mother's side. A small operation, maybe 12 employees, nothing to do with commercial real estate. He'd kept it running more out of loyalty to the people who worked there than anything else. He loved that company in a quiet way that didn't have anything to do with money. Harlan had contracted them to maintain properties across the portfolio. Legitimate-looking contracts. Reasonable rates. The properties were fraudulent assets. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Kroger for 40 minutes before I could drive home. Then I went inside, made dinner, and ate with Lionel, and listened to him talk about a client he was trying to help and laughed at the right moments, and I did not tell him. I told him everything the night before the enforcement action. It was a Tuesday. I sat down across from him at our kitchen table. The same table where I'd stared at the ceiling almost 2 years earlier, and I told him from the beginning who Donovan was, what Petra had flagged, what I'd found, what Jessa had brought to me, what his father had been doing, what his landscaping company had been used for without his knowledge. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "How long?" "Close to 2 years." Another silence. "My company," he said. "You're clear," I said. "They know you didn't know. They confirmed that early. Your company is going to be audited and formally cleared. Your name comes off everything." He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Not angry, not yet. Just asking. "Because I didn't know how to tell you something was wrong with your father, without it destroying everything while I was still trying to figure out if I was right. And then once I knew I was right, I was afraid of what it would cost you to carry it." He didn't respond to that immediately. We sat in that kitchen for a long time. Eventually, he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. He didn't say anything else that night. Neither did I. The enforcement action happened on a Friday morning. Harlan was served at his home in Indian Hill at 7:40 a.m. Ashton, who had no involvement in the fraud, found out via phone call from his mother, who had been home when the agents arrived. Jessa was in Columbus for a work trip. She texted me one word, "Okay." I was at the Beckett Capital Group office building downtown by 8 o'clock. Not as an employee, not as a family member, as a cooperating source who had agreed to be present during the document retrieval process as a subject matter consultant. The receptionist, who had looked through me for 3 years, every time I came to pick Lionel up for lunch, watched me walk in with 2 SEC investigators and a forensic accountant from the regional office and did not know what to say. I didn't either, so I just nodded. The formal proceeding came 11 weeks later, the conference room on the 14th floor of a federal building downtown. Harlan's attorney had prepared a strategy. I was a disgruntled daughter-in-law. I had personal grievances. I had manufactured a narrative to settle a score, accumulated over years of feeling inadequate in his family. He said the word resentment so many times in his opening presentation that I started keeping track. 7. He said it 7 times in 40 minutes. What he could not explain away was $42 million in documented fraudulent loan originations. 3. Cooperating witnesses from inside the operation, including the CFO, who had decided, when presented with the government's case, that loyalty to Harlan Beckett was no longer a rational investment strategy. Jessa's photographs, Donovan's team's complete reconstruction of 9 years of financial transactions. The proceedings were not a trial in the criminal sense. This was an SEC enforcement action that ran parallel to and ahead of the federal criminal charges that followed. Harlan eventually pled guilty on 11 counts. The criminal sentence came 4 months later. 12 years. I wasn't in the room when the sentence was read. I was in a coffee shop 3 blocks away with Donovan, who had ordered a coffee he wasn't going to drink, which I'd come to understand was just something he did. He got the notification on his phone. He set it down and said, "That's it." I said, "Yeah." We sat there for a minute without talking. What I remember most from the days that followed isn't the verdict. It's 2 other things. The first is Jessa, standing in the lobby of the federal building after the enforcement proceedings, very still, with her coat still buttoned like she'd forgotten she was inside. I walked up to her. She turned and looked at me and said, "Is this what I thought it would feel like?" I said, "I don't know what you thought." She said, "Smaller, and also bigger." Both at the same time. I didn't have anything more useful to say than that. We stood there together for a while. The second thing is, a woman I'd never met before, who came and sat in the public gallery on the day of the sentencing. I'd heard her name during the investigation. Her name was Tilda, and she was a small business owner who had leased commercial space in one of Harlan's properties, signed a long-term lease based on the inflated valuations and the bank's approval, and had spent 2.5 years fighting to stay solvent after the loan backing. The building collapsed and the property changed hands twice in 14 months. She'd had to let go of 4 employees. She'd had to renegotiate her lease terms under duress. She'd kept her business open through what she described in her victim impact statement as the most expensive education in reading the fine print I never had to learn. I didn't approach her. She didn't know who I was. After the sentence was read, she sat very still, and then she closed her eyes for a moment, and then she gathered her things and walked out. I watched her go and thought about everything that had been set in motion by a too high number on an appraisal report, and how far that ripple traveled before it reached her, and what 12 years meant to her versus what it meant to Harlan. Marguerite filed for divorce 3 months after the sentencing. Ashton didn't speak to me for a year, and then one morning he texted me an apology that was only 1 sentence long and clearly cost him something. I texted back 2 words. "Thank you." Lionel's landscaping company was audited by an independent firm, cleared completely, and formally decoupled from any association with Beckett Capital Group. When the auditor called with the final determination, Lionel was in the backyard doing something with the garden, and I went and found him and told him, and he just sat down in the grass in his work clothes and stared at the fence for a minute. The landscaping company is still running. He keeps it because his grandfather's name is still on the original incorporation paperwork, and that means something to him. I think about that sometimes. The way a thing can be used without your knowledge and still come back to you clean. Donovan retired from the SEC regional office last spring. He sent me an email that was 4 sentences and formally professional and had exactly the warmth of a tax filing, which is exactly his register, and I appreciated it completely. I don't talk about any of this usually. This is the first time I've put it in order from beginning to end. What I want to say, for whatever it's worth, is that I wasn't trying to bring anyone down. I was trying to look clearly at something that was in front of me and do the thing that I couldn't not do. Those are different motivations, and they produce different results, even when they end in the same place. I had a colleague ask me once, after the story had made its rounds in the oblique way that stories do, whether I'd been afraid of what it would cost my marriage. And I said yes. Genuinely, plainly yes. There were 3 or 4 points in those 2 years where I thought I was going to have to choose between being honest about what I knew and holding on to the thing I wanted most. I don't know that I made the right decision every step of the way. I know that Lionel and I are still at that kitchen table, still catching the same bus now that we got the house in Oakley, still doing what we were doing before any of this happened. I know that Tilda's business is still open. I know that the 4 employees she had to let go, I hope some of them landed somewhere good. The Beckett family didn't think of me as a threat, because they didn't think of me much at all. That's not bitterness. It's just accounting. I've always been good at accounting, and the thing about numbers is, they don't care who's looking at them. They just sit there, patient, waiting for someone to add them up correctly. I was the someone. That's the whole story.